Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. I'll let you get through this video, of course, but if at the end of it you have got some value out of it, please do share it with like-minded people. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help to boost the performance of videos in YouTube's algorithm. And indeed, that algorithm is rather pernicious, and it's very important that you interact in this way so that more people find the content that we produce. Thank you also to everyone who has helped support the channel through Patreon and also through Buy Me a Coffee. It really does help to continue the work that we do, and everyone's support is massively, massively appreciated. Today, I'm joined by Andrew Chakhoyan, who is a Ukrainian American based in the Netherlands and is a vocal and articulate champion of Ukraine and its causes. He has written some fantastic articles recently in various publications, leading publications such as Politico, Newsweek, and others. And also, he is an avid correspondent with publications whenever there's an article, perhaps that puts a slant on Russia's war that he takes issue with. And that is exactly what we're going to be discussing today. Just one of those instances. Andrew, welcome back.
So good to be with you. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, you picked out this article in The Economist, and I think it triggered a kind of train of thought with you that we're going to dive into. But actually, it's not unique because there was a similar article in The Economist, not The Economist, in The Spectator just a couple of weeks before on this same topic. The idea that somehow, yes, Ukraine is a victim, but also Russian-speaking Ukrainians are victims here, not just of the aggressor, Russia itself, but somehow they are internal victims of a cultural purge within Ukraine. Now, having been to Ukraine recently, these two articles struck a really odd tone for me because it's difficult to see evidence of what they're pointing out. You're in a much better position to comment on this. So, what really exercised you about these articles? What really, motivated you to pen a letter and the sort of commentary we see on LinkedIn and other social platforms in relation to these articles?
No, thank you. Thank you for mentioning it. It's the article was by Arkady Ostrovsky, who writes for The Economist, and the topic was cancel culture in Ukraine. And for me, the big question is the timing and the fact that a Russian person is explaining Ukraine to the world. I did complain on Twitter saying, if Russians get to explain Ukraine, why wouldn't we have Ukrainians explain Russia? Which I then try to do, and I think that should be a central theme of our conversation. So one thing that you hear a lot is this the claim of victimhood, and I think Timothy Snyder put it so well. Russia's talk of victimhood is part of the crime. It's so important to understand that when a country is starting a criminal war of aggression, and it is a criminal war under international law, under the ICC, under UN Charter. If if out of the blue a country decides to invade a neighbor and occupy the territory, it's a war of aggression, and it's a crime of aggression, one of only four crimes that ICC can go after. And so once you're there, and then the nation itself, or the people who live in the country that is uh, the aggressor, suddenly claim they're the victims, or something else is more important than the war they're waging. And and the same as attribution of responsibility or attribution of guilt. I think those are also two very important words. The article that I addressed talked about Putin's war, and my point was there is no such a thing. If you ask a Ukrainian, was that Putin who killed their family? Was it Putin who crossed the border in a tank? The answer is no. It's Russian people waging a war on Ukraine, and it was no Putin around in 1930 when Russian people tried to genocide Ukraine, to extinguish a national movement, to prohibit Ukraine from asserting its identity and saying we're an independent country. You know, the Russian Empire collapsed. We want to build our own state, and that was a no-go for the Kremlin. And so the genocide tried 100 years ago, and it's tried again.
So, what is it about the structure of Russia as a sort of polity that propels it to expand and to look at expansion as the main value of success or failure of its politicians? Because it would seem that most European states have moved beyond that as any kind of measure of success of an individual leader or of the political class as a whole.
Yeah, it's a super important conversation to have. Is where does France come from right now, or UK? It's a post-imperial state, post-imperial nation, country. Uh, how did France become post-imperial? It had to lose a war in Algeria, right? Up until then, there was a French empire. It was slowly disintegrating, and colonies were declaring independence, but Algeria, France held on to it for a long, long time, and it's hard to grasp. It's not been that long. It's in the 60s that the war was lost, and France has finally said, "Okay, we've lost. Algeria is independent. We are a French nation within French borders." This was a thing that the French people had to learn. Russian people did not have to learn any of it, and I would I think there's this duality of colonizer who's colonized. So there's this loop in a collective psyche of the Russian Federation. If you look at history, you say, okay, Moscow was this you know village on a swampy banks of a Moskva River, and what was it? Suddenly they figured out how to work with the uh, Mongols and were collecting taxes, and that helped this little city-state. At that time, there was nothing but city-state. The national borders, as an idea, are very new phenomena. Like for now, like everybody who's my age or younger, like you look at the globe and then you see borders, you see countries. It's obvious. You have UN, 190 something countries are part of it, and the borders are understood as a kind of stable, relatively stable phenomena. But it's very new. It's not even a century old idea. Uh, but then when we go back to Russia, it had to expand because it didn't see an end to it. Like it would expand a little bit and then realize there's no end and then expand again. And so whoever gets to be a Russian citizen or inhabitant, I think is a better word because citizen means both rights and responsibilities. But who lives in that big, vast land, a lot of the identities are colonized identities. And they have to deal with the trauma of their identities being taken away. When a person in Tatarstan is told that you're not Tatar, you're Russian, and they have to live with this kind of pressure, speak Russian language, you know, kind of sideline their own culture or demean it. But then all this anger, all this frustration is embedded in the entire place. And so I think there's this deep void of insecurity within the whole entire structure, and it has to lash out to kind of bring that suffering onto someone else to deal with the suffering that the colonized lands live through themselves. And this is a vicious cycle, and it only ends when the aggressive empire loses a war.
Because we think of Putin, we think of his own personal issues, demons, and where he came from through the KGB and very much that generation that still has an extremely sort of Soviet kind of mindset. So we tend to see this war as, yes, this is Putin's, this is a projection of his aggression. But if that was the case and it didn't align with the majority of Russians, then it seems to me there'd be no way he'd carry it out. There'd be no way that everyone would follow his orders, and that there wouldn't be some, widespread, not an organized revolution, because we know, the inability of the Russian opposition to kind of get it together to deliver something like that, and that they lack the sort of threshold support for that. But nonetheless, it really doesn't bear out the idea that unless he could tap into some national ideas, national values, national aspirations, none of this would even be possible. And indeed, he wouldn't even try, because there'd be no benefit in going against, the majority feeling of your people. So it does suggest there is far more in commonality between his objectives and those of the broad sweep of the population. Is that simplistic, or do you detect that some validity there?
It's spot on, and you had Jade McGlynn on your podcast, and I quote her in almost everything I write, and she says that Putin doesn't define the agenda as much as he articulates it. And I think it's so true that actually two things could be true at the same time. Putin, one man made a decision to invade. That's true. I think that's fair. Uh, but also the other phrase that I think is quite fair, it's not Putin's Russia, it's Russia's Putin. This we need to remember. I have this mental image of a windmill or a water mill, and it just moves. And to me, those are the wheels of Russia's history, or it's where the history is pushing the state, or the czar or whoever gets to sit in the Kremlin. And and on one hand, they always have this choice, but it's a false choice because the history demands of them to reassert Russia's greatness in quotations. It's not they're the person in the Kremlin is the victim of Russian history, this empire that refuses to know that it's an empire. It's it's this contradiction. The Soviet Union was running around the world fighting imperialism while the Soviet Union itself was an empire. And so it's this once again this duality is the whole entire system is a colonial system, but it's not acknowledged. And then Putin does what the history demands of him, but he is an agent as well. So he brings Russia to war. And the other very solid explanation is democratic Ukraine is a threat to the regime, to this kleptocracy that Putin has built. That's also completely true, and that very much is a motivation. But I say that almost from history, all you can tell is this must be happening no matter who is in charge, no matter what's a kleptocracy or communism, or it doesn't matter. The big force is this the imperial nature of the state. I can't remember who coined this phrase. Russia was born an empire. It was never a country that expanded into empire. It just didn't exist. It existed as Moscovia, but as as the lands were acquired, it just never had a chance to have a nation. So there is no national idea because there's no nation. It's empire through and through, and there's nothing else.
Mm. And it's possible, we'll never know, but it's possible that the people of Novgorod, Suzdal, Vladimir may have had a very different conception of the state. They may have had a conception of their role within a very different sort of political structure in relation to their city-state that may or may not have resembled something far close to, say, you'd get in Italy and so on. But that, unlike Italy, where you had the state growing up by these entities kind of converging and merging their identities, we know that Russia's grown through a process of eradication. We don't know what Novgorodians thought because they were all wiped out and their cities razed to the ground. I mean, so still you've got some nice remains of that. It's maybe maybe the best preserved kind of town, but in Russia historically, it's almost like walking on a film set. But you wouldn't get any sense there that you would have an identity distinct from, a Suzdal conception of the state or so on. I mean, it's become an ethno-Russian imperial conception. That then gets imposed on the other nationalities that get subsumed by their empire. What's the Ukrainian perspective of that then? Because Ukraine has deeper roots as a state. It has a history independent of its control of Muscovy, but a lot of that has been eradicated. A lot of the historical documentation that attested to that independence has been eradicated. And in some respects, Ukraine has had to relearn parts of identity, not just once, but multiple times in the process of de-Russification. So what's Ukraine's relationship to that imperial entity, and does it have more of the vestiges of, say, a nation state, or more foundations at least on which to build?
I think this is the million-dollar question we should have been asking a long time ago to understand why the conflict is probably the wrong word, why Russia's or Moscow aggression towards Ukraine is and it's inevitable rather than it's an aberration. It's embedded in this narrative or the founding myth. For Russia to exist, it needs to take Ukraine's history and make it Russian history, because otherwise the myth collapses. You mentioned Novgorod. This is, I don't know if it's ironic, but the very founding of Moscovia starts when tyranny defeats democracy. Novgorod fought Moscovia, and Moscovia won because it had the backing of the Mongolian Khans, and it had the resources from the tax collection. But then Novgorod falls, and Novgorod was modeled on a Ukrainian model, a democratic model, and then that's the founding of Moscovia. And if Russia knew its history, it would know that tyranny won over democracy. That's how the country, where it comes from. But then this revisionism to say, no, we're an ancient civilization. That's what Moscow czars wanted to claim. And they want to say that our civilization, our Moscovia civilization, started in Kiev. But if Ukraine is independent, this thing collapses, the house of cards collapses, and then Russia doesn't exist. It simply has no story to tell itself. It would have to go back and say, we just were there, uh, you know, born in subordination to the Huns, and then perpetuated this model of subjugation and humiliation of the population, the tyranny, not democracy. There's n no history of that the Kievan Rus had of you know mid medieval civilization. Russia never had that history, but it stole it from Ukraine to claim it. And now, when you say independent and democratic Ukraine is a threat to Putin regime, that is absolutely correct, because Putin's regime is a tyranny, a dictatorship. And the worry is, oh, if Ukraine was democratic and successful, it will be an example. That's correct and true, and big part of it. But the other part is deeper. It's not threat to the regime, it's threat to the national claimed myth. And the country is always a myth. Like, how do French people know they're French? Because they have shared history, they have heroes, they have books, they have language. There's something in their story. How Americans know they're Americans is the Constitution. It's the founding document that brings the nation together. Russia's myth collapses if Ukraine really claims its history. If Kiev claims the history of Kievan Rus, which belongs to Kiev, then it's very hard for Russian narrative to sustain itself and to say we are this great Russia with messianic mission, the third Rome, or whatever the stories they wish to tell the population to keep this monstrosity together.
And other countries don't have a problem acknowledging some of those roots. I mean, Britain was essentially, conquered the Norman conquest, which radically changed its cultural course. And there are multiple instances, from the Romans and others to where the history of the islands that might have followed one course were dramatically altered and changed, and other culture and another linguistic direction grafted on. And yet it doesn't prevent a national story from emerging. And again, you have different regions, whether it be the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, and of course there is a problematic relationship through history. Nonetheless, these identities were not totally erased by that imperial process, and indeed, at its height, the British Empire in the 19th century was a fusion between, Scots ingenuity, for instance. They were not seen as a secondary culture. They're not seen as inferior to English culture. Well, not everyone would have. I mean, there might be some English people who might have thought that way. But it seems that that is a point of view that you could have almost win-win. That almost seems like a quite a post-industrial mindset. It seems to me that what we term sort of the Russian genocide and the need to steal other cultures, um, we put it in a moral framework, and of course it's deeply despicable, but it also seems to be a feature of a very extractive mindset that does not see the world in terms of a win-win outcome, which means that, you know, if you extract resources from the ground and that's the only way you can create wealth, it seems that same approach is there to cultures as well. You cannot have two. They cannot coexist. You cannot have multiple identities. No, there has to be one. Otherwise, there'll be sort of chaos and disorder.
Yeah, it's what is Russia as an entity? When we think of Russia, it really is Moscow-centered oppression system. It's the extractive system where Moscow has the most billionaires per capita. I don't know if it's still true, but it was true for a while because it has so many inhabitants, and there are no other billionaires anywhere in Russia. They're all there because it's this place that extracts wealth, and then it needs to then somehow reassure itself and the rest of the inhabitants of this, you know, all the way to Vladivostok, that that's a system that is worth maintaining. As soon as Russian Tsar is not able to articulate or justify the system that it must be this way, then why would it stay together? Why would this whole thing stay together? When India decided that they wanted to go their own way and London couldn't keep the empire together, off it went. So because Russia is this continuous land empire, it still needs to justify this extractive system, all for the benefit of Moscow. And how does it do it? It needs to oppress and tell stories, right? It needs to, when it takes freedom from folks in Far East or in the Caucasus, when it installs somebody like Kadyrov to be kind of a representative of the Tsar, keeping everybody down. When the system is offered, the freedom is taken, and what's given, right, is what Moscow then gives is this the myth of Russian greatness, is saying we will you know excuse you from your agency. You will have no freedom, no voice, but we will expect nothing of you either. But then you get to be this great Russian, and this is like imagine living this kind of life, and I think it manifests itself when a Russian person anywhere doesn't feel responsible for the war. They might know the war is happening, but they'd rather not know. Uh, and I'm not, there's also the word guilt and responsibility, right? Who is guilty? People who are committing war crimes are guilty. Putin is a wanted war criminal. He's guilty. But hundred something million Russians, they're responsible. They're a willing or apathetic accomplice. So they have to deal with this responsibility, but they'd rather not, because the system, the colonial system, where everything is subordinated to Moscow in this exchange of freedom for the myth of greatness or for this story and for conquest, and then they buy this Faustian bargain.
So now we turn to the challenge of some of these narratives. How do you counter these narratives? Because this is a fairly complex set of kind of conclusions to come to, and it's easy in some ways, especially when not just the media but also historians have been stuck, for large parts of the process of historiography, looking at great men and the acts of great men and looking through the world through their eyes. I think Tolstoy was one of the sort of first writers to say, well, hang on a second, that's one way of interpreting events. But also here, like in the Napoleonic Wars, you have millions of people who are acting a certain way, moving, in this instance, across thousands of miles, committing acts of violence, theft, and so on. Just this great man narrative doesn't explain all of that. That brings us back to the idea of Russia's war as opposed to Putin's war. How do you interpret current events there? Because we also know that Yulia Navalny, Vladimir Karamurza, and many others, they try to absolve the Russian people of crimes by saying, look, you cannot accuse everybody, and you cannot say that everyone is complicit. You cannot put that guilt on everyone. This is Putin's war. In some ways, that feels like a real cop out for me.
Hmm. Yeah, they're in a bind. So there are two things happening. On one hand, they need to abandon the imperial narratives, imperial ambition of the Russian state. As soon as they do it, they become irrelevant. Nobody will want them because it's a collective psyche of the 100 million people. So to remain relevant, to say we have some legitimacy, we need to oppose Putin, but not Russian imperialism, because Russian imperialism is all there is. And and it's very difficult to say what to advise. It's almost I write that Russia's aggression and violence is inseparable from Russia as a unitary state. It will do what it does. So if somebody comes up on the platform, political platform of saying decentralization of Russia, we need to give voices to the regions, we need to give more autonomy to the regions. They need to be comfortable with the idea that the Russian Empire will fall apart. But if they want to rule all of Russia, if they want to be yet another person in charge of it, uh, then devolution of power to the regions is a no-go because it will lead to the disintegration of this Frankenstein state. So yeah, I don't call them opposition. I've written some of my views about so-called opposition because they're failing to oppose the actual root of the problem. If they do not start by saying that Putin acts on behalf of Russia's history, on behalf of Russian colonialism, on behalf of this violent state that cannot help but invade. So it's not Putin's war. It's Russian people that empower, or Russian history, or this absent national identity that pushes the czar or the ruler in that direction, no matter what. But they are more comfortable blaming Putin. Even that is also a risk, right? So there is something for us all to kind of reconcile. So if somebody wants Putin gone, are they um, on the right side of history along with Ukraine? Yes, but how are they going about it? Are they calling for, take all the sanctions off? Then at that point, no. So it's it's I don't envy them. Being a Russian opposition is you know maybe I'll say another thing. So being an opposition, the word conveys a system of democracy where opposition is to exist and to have meaning, but it cannot have meaning in the imperial system. So by pretending that they're the opposition, we're then pretending that Russia is a democracy, and it's not. So there's some dissenting voices that mostly no one cares for. And that's just, yeah, it's hard to know what to tell them. And the real opposition, as Ukrainians say, is um, in the Russian volunteer battalion. If a Russian person opposes Putin regime, they can join Ukrainian military and fight the war, right? And defeat the evil forces that were sent to conquer Ukrainian lands.
And of course, we know there are some Russians in those battalions and in those
Right.
ranks, and not everyone on the street will have contact with that, but some people will do in various legions. And of course, there are people from Georgia and there are people from Belarus as well. Again, in those trenches fighting directly. Um, it's tricky though, isn't it? Because you're more familiar with the sort of structure of the media. How do you think voices like Arkady Ostorovsky, now obviously he's been around for a long time, he's been writing for a long time from a sort of Russian liberal perspective, but he has his biases, as we can clearly see in those articles. He does not necessarily have good sources on the ground. There may be other motivations going on there. One has to ask, well, why was that article published at all? Why was it published now? Why was that particular angle chosen? Why do you have both the Economist and the Spectator doing very similar activities when in fact, let's say the Spectator has a fantastic writer, Svetlana Maranets, on the staff? I mean, was she consulted? Was she asked whether she feels that same thing and about the suppression of Soviet Russian culture, etc., and language? I doubt it. What do you think's going on here? Is this just incidental? Is it accidental imperialism, or is there something a little more pernicious going on?
I think there is demand for this kind of content and there is supply. It's a saving grace that the um, Arkady Ostrovsky is a Russian person, right? So he has to carry that burden in some sense. He needs to wake up every day knowing that he's Russian and Russian people are waging this war. So it's an uncomfortable idea. It's much easier to then pivot to Putin and call it Putin's war. The other problem is back to what it means to be a Russian person. It's an because there is no country, there is no nation, there is just a Russian Empire. So by extension, a Russian person is an imperialist through and through in their conception of both Russia and the world. So it's inseparable. He, he cannot be both uh, a well-educated Russian person and not be an imperialist. It's those things cannot happen. As soon as that happens, then they become not just dissidents, but they will stop being Russian in a sense because they will recognize that it doesn't exist. So how could you be that? If you recognize that there is Moscovia and there's colonized lands, and so as soon as you say, "Oh, now I'm not Russian, I'm a Muscovite or whatever," and maybe at that point you can be making all kinds of arguments. But if he needs to wake up knowing that he's a Russian person, he needs to somehow justify um, to himself and to the world what's happening, and and so that's a supply part. There is a demand part. Um, if you and I both know that Europe and US are not doing it nearly enough. And why are we not? Because first of all, doing anything is always hard. Allocating resources, finding political will, doing the right thing is hard. Um, and we, as Western societies, we like for things to just get better, to be better, rather than stepping up and acting with responsibility. We wish for things to be better. And then we think there must be saving grace. There must be this Navalny on the white horse that will bring democracy to Russia because that makes us safe. It feels like maybe we don't have to do all that much. Maybe we don't have to raise the level of defense spending or contemplate the idea that European troops will have to eventually fight you know, fight and die, right? Like those things are hard. So we crave the idea that Russia could itself somehow be a democracy. The more I'm reading about Russian history, the less I'm convinced it's possible. I think democracy is irreconcilable with the idea of unitary Russian state with an extractive system centered on Moscow. It's not. If it becomes a democracy, it can't exist the way that the system is. It will, over time, turn into something else. So the answer is I see why it's happening. I see why both the readers kind of wish to read about great Russian culture and think, oh, I've been enamored with all those authors or ballet and so on. So it's difficult to wake up and say all this was a lie, or all those people I used to respect and admire are suddenly turning out to be this aggressive state that is willing to cross the border, kill, rape, torture, and and because it doesn't, in Russia specialists or fans of Russian culture, it's those things are hard to keep in one's head. So therefore we crave this kind of content. We wish for things to be different or to be somehow more nuanced and so on. Um, Last thing I'll say is I remember writing this line saying that Russians came to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians for being Ukrainian. And for us in the West, we cannot grasp it because we moved on. We moved on from this kind of thing. We left it behind. Like French and Germany used to fight each other all the time, but we feel like we passed this. Like we live in a different universe, so it cannot be this way. And we reject it. We think that's not true. That's not what's going on. And then we keep finding, what we think is kind of flimsy justification, but we hold on to it because it makes us more comfortable. Because knowing that there is genocide happening next door and we failed to act, we failed to prevent it. We, the West, have the resources, have the means, have everything at our disposal, but we've not done much to make sure it doesn't happen. And therefore we share responsibility, but we don't want it. We'd rather not carry this responsibility. So off we go. Russian culture, saving grace. Let's look for something. Maybe those Ukrainians are in fact evil. Maybe they're prosecuting Russian language, which is what Ostrovsky insinuates. He's not, you know, writing a very damning, but he's finding all kinds of subtleties. But it's not the time and place for it.
And it's I mean the last point on this, it muddies the waters, doesn't it? And actually we know that one of the main mechanics that works both internally and externally of Russian propaganda is это неоднозначно.
Yeah,
Nothing is simple. And unfortunately these articles very much play into that. It almost implies that somehow, yeah, Ukrainians aren't so innocent after all, which is completely inappropriate in this context.
yeah. No, it's the phrase that I dispute. Is he says, "Oh, it just so happens that both the aggressor and the victim speak Russian language," and and my answer is, but it's aggressor first and foremost. It's the aggressor who been trying to erase Ukrainian identity for centuries. Aggressor, why is my native language Russian? I was born in Donetsk. I have Armenian Jewish roots. Why is my native language Russian? Why is it not Armenian? Why is it not Yiddish? My grandma spoke Yiddish. My father spoke Armenian. Why is my native language Russian? So if I can answer this question, it has to do with colonization of that land. It has to do with forced repopulation by czars, commissars, you name it. And then here comes Arkady Ostrovsky and tells us that both the victim and the aggressor are speaking the same language, and it's very complicated and неоднозначно. It's not that simple. It's not that simple, but it is also quite simple. There is a Moscow is attempting genocide, and Ukraine is resisting it. I also say, look, let's have all those conversations, but only after the Russian people stop killing Ukrainians. Maybe after they atone. And then folks say, but in Canada, they speak French and English. in Ukraine, they speak French and English or Russian and Ukrainian. Has it stopped Russia from invading?
Not at all, no.
I, no one ever told me not to speak Russian in Ukraine. Like, I've never felt any pressure as I was growing up or as I've traveled to Ukraine. Never have I ever felt that me not being fluent in Ukrainian was in any way a limitation. Now I actually I don't want to speak Russian language. I switched to Ukrainian and finally learned it. And and who- why? Because of what the Russian people are doing.
And
Yeah.
this is an interesting one, isn't it? This also comes back to a very vertical, hierarchical, um, punitive society like Russia compared to the sort of chaotic, horizontal, which is Ukraine. It seems to me that until Russian aggression, Ukrainians are mostly perfectly comfortable with a multiplicity of identities and multiple identities and language existing in the same person, whether that's Armenian Jewish Ukrainian, whether that is Greek Ukrainian or Hungarian Ukrainian, whatever it happens to be. Ukraine seems to be far more tolerant of these complexities and nuances. Whereas it's not that Russia's come in here to protect Russian speakers or, specifically to kill Russian speakers. It seems that what they don't like is people who are able to be multiple things at the same time. So if you're going to be Russian, but you can't be Russian, Ukrainian, this, that, the other, and it seems a certain level of intolerance to complexity.
I really like what you said, the horizontal society. For me, Ukraine's national idea is encapsulated in just one single word, voля. It's both willpower and freedom all in one word, or you can even say will to freedom, and and it's so central. It's Cossacks in Zaporizhia, or even further back. It always mattered this idea of will to freedom and self-determination and grassroots democracy. Like all of those are absolutely fundamental Ukrainian values, and Ukraine is always uh, suspicious of a central authority. It's almost why, even in the US, the presidents usually serve 2 terms. In Ukraine, you could run for second term, but if you look at elections, every time whoever's in power gets thrown out because Ukraine wants a new person, because they're suspicious of central authority generally, whereas Russia cannot exist without central authority. And that goes to this national idea. In Ukraine, you have one encapsulated in a single word. In Russia, you do not have one because you cannot have it. You can have a colonial or this monstrosity has an idea, the imperial idea of conquest, oppression, and subjugation. But the national idea cannot exist until there is a nation, and it cannot be a nation until it let go of colonies. I I think there's one thing that we need to really process as we comment on Russia or Ukraine, the divergence of the interest of the state, professed or exercised interest of the state, and the interest of people populating the lands. Professed interest of the state, as Putin told us, or as anybody else who would invade the neighbors running the Kremlin, is to invade and to send people to die and kill. Is it the interest of people inhabiting the lands? No. Is it the interest of people inhabiting the lands that the oil revenue all ends up making Moscow rich and everybody else living in, you know, subhuman conditions all around Russia? Those those villages and cities are the if you look at the imagery is not great. But it's not the interest of the state to maintain this myth of Russian greatness, to militarism, the rest of it, like they diverge. What Russia says it wants to do, it's not necessarily in the interest of the people. And if we grasp it in the West, we would know that defeating Russia, helping Ukraine defeat Russia, is in the interest of the people like inhabiting the Russian lands, because that's actually really, really good for the Russian people if Russia, the state, was defeated, because they will have a window of opportunity to atone, to learn why is Germany and Japan such successful countries today? Well, they had the gift of defeat. Russia needs that gift. We need to give them this important, very useful thing for that place is to be defeated in the war and to learn what they've done.
That's a fantastic place to end, a very poignant place to hopefully people can go and sort of think that and unpack that idea and watch other sources such as Timothy Schneider who are fantastic and dig into that very point there. Losing the last imperial war is the point at which that imperial dream starts to move on to something more beneficial to the population of the country. For today, though, Andrew, huge pleasure. Thank you so much for bearing with the technical issues we had yesterday. Thank you so much for coming onto the channel, and it's a huge pleasure. We'll put a little extra clip out as well, containing a little bit of our conversation yesterday. That will be in a separate video, put out as a little extra. But hopefully, yeah, people get a lot of value from this.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for supporting Ukraine.